They looked right through me like I was furniture, like I was background noise in a room I had built, like my name was something they couldn't quite be bothered to remember. But here's what nobody tells you about being invisible. You get to see everything, and I saw it all. Every lie, every stolen idea, every smug smile. I kept quiet, I kept notes, and I waited. This is my story, and I promise you, nobody saw the ending coming, not even me. Before we go any further, if you are the kind of person who believes that what goes around comes around, hit that subscribe button right now, because every single week we bring you stories exactly like this one. Real, raw, and absolutely unbelievable. Now let's get into it. My name is Della. I was 28 years old, living in a tiny apartment in Brooklyn, taking the subway every morning into Midtown Manhattan to walk through the glass doors of one of the most prestigious fashion houses in America, Whitmore and Kane. You've seen their ads. You've probably walked past their stores on Fifth Avenue without thinking twice. Old money, old power, old habits. The kind of company that had oil paintings in the lobby and fresh flowers delivered every Monday morning that cost more than my monthly grocery bill. I was a senior analyst in the strategy division. I had a master's degree, 3 years of industry experience before I even walked through their doors, and a mind that could pull patterns out of numbers the way other people read headlines. I was good. I knew I was good. But good, I would learn, was not the currency that mattered most in that building. The currency that mattered was who you knew, what you looked like, and whose last name was on the wall. I was the only black woman on the entire executive floor. Let me say that again slowly, so it lands the way it should. The only one. In a company that sold luxury fashion globally to every kind of woman on earth, I was the only one. I wasn't the only one who noticed. I was just the only one willing to stay and do something about it. The office had a way of making you feel small without ever saying anything directly. It was in the way conversations would shift when I walked into a room, the way my ideas would land in silence and then somehow reappear 20 minutes later from someone else's mouth and get a round of applause. It was in the way the executive assistant, a sweet but oblivious woman named Patricia, would default to asking me to handle room setup and coffee orders, even though my title was senior analyst and hers was administrative coordinator. I smiled. I set up the rooms. I made note of every single thing. Then there was Conrad Whitmore III, the CEO, the grandson of the man who founded the company with Eleanor Bassett back in 1971. Conrad was 54 years old, silver-haired and charming in that particular way that powerful men who have never been told no can be, effortlessly, dangerously charming. He walked into rooms like they had been built specifically for him. Maybe they had been. He had inherited the company at 32, and in the 22 years since, he had coasted on the brand equity that Eleanor and his grandfather had built, slowly hollowing out everything that made it special while dressing the decline in expensive press releases. I had my first real interaction with Conrad 3 months into my tenure. I had spent 6 weeks building a full market recovery strategy, a response to declining retail performance across their Northeast locations, 53 pages, custom data models, projected revenue recovery timelines. I presented it in a Tuesday morning executive session. I was 4 minutes into my presentation when Conrad leaned over to the man beside him, whispered something, and then looked up at me mid-sentence and said pleasantly, like he was doing me a favor, "Actually, could you check if we have more coffee coming? I think we're running low." The room laughed. A few people didn't. I smiled, nodded, and stepped out. I stood in the hallway for exactly 30 seconds. Then I walked back in, sat down, and finished my presentation to the 3 people who were still paying attention. That night, I opened a new folder on my personal laptop. I titled it simply, Documentation. And from that day forward, I put everything in it. Conrad's right hand was a man named Sterling Vale, 35, Yale-educated, the kind of handsome that photographs well and means nothing in a real conversation. Sterling had been with the company for 4 years and risen meteorically, not because he was exceptional, but because Conrad saw himself in Sterling, and powerful men have a remarkable weakness for mirrors. Sterling was polished, articulate, and almost completely hollow underneath. He survived and thrived by doing one thing exceptionally well. He knew how to take other people's work and present it as his own with such total confidence that even the people it was stolen from began to doubt themselves. He stole from me for the first time 2 months after the coffee incident. I had developed a wholesale restructuring proposal, a framework for renegotiating the company's international retail partnerships, starting with their accounts in West Africa and the United Kingdom. It was detailed, it was bold, and it would have worked. Sterling requested a copy under the pretense of providing feedback. 3 days later, he walked into a closed executive session, one I was not invited to, and presented my framework word for word. A colleague who was in that room told me afterward, quietly, with the kind of discomfort that comes from knowing something wrong happened and not being brave enough to say it out loud to anyone who mattered. I didn't confront him. I didn't send a heated email. I opened my documentation folder, added the time-stamped original files, noted the date of Sterling's presentation, noted my colleague's account, and I kept moving. I want to be clear about something. What I was building wasn't revenge. Revenge is emotional and messy, and it tends to hurt the person building it more than the person it's aimed at. What I was building was a case. There was a difference. One is about feeling better. The other is about being right in a room where it counts. What nobody in that office knew, what Conrad and Sterling had never thought to find out because they had never thought to ask, was that I had a relationship they couldn't have predicted. 18 months before the coffee incident, before I even joined Whitmore & Kane, I had met Eleanor Bassett at an industry panel in London. She was 71, retired, and electrifying. We talked for 2 hours after the event. She had been watching the company she co-founded deteriorate from the outside for years, and when she met me, when she saw the way my mind worked and heard me speak about the industry, she made a decision. She would mentor me, quietly, privately, with a specific purpose. Eleanor had told me once, sitting in her home in Connecticut with a cup of green tea in her hand and the sharpest eyes I had ever seen, "The most dangerous person in any room is the one they forgot to watch." I had written that down. I thought about it every single morning on the subway. Here is what Sterling and Conrad didn't know was happening underneath them while they congratulated each other in boardrooms. The company was bleeding, quietly, seriously, structurally bleeding. My original analysis, the framework Sterling stole, had uncovered it, but the recovery portion of my proposal had been buried under his repackaging. 3 flagship stores were underperforming at levels that should have triggered emergency protocols. Their primary manufacturing partner in Milan was quietly pulling out of the agreement, communicating only through lawyers. And most damningly, there was a pattern in the consulting fee expenditures that didn't add up. Payments flowing out to a company I couldn't find any public record of, in amounts that escalated every quarter. I dug. I cross-referenced. I called a friend who worked in corporate financial forensics. The shell company receiving those fees was connected to Sterling's brother-in-law. I sat with that information for 2 weeks. Then I sent everything, every document, every file, every time-stamped original, the forensic analysis, all of it, to the company's independent legal advisor. Not the in-house counsel who reported to Conrad, the independent one, the one with a fiduciary obligation to the board. I did it on a Tuesday night in my kitchen table, in my pajamas, with a cup of chamomile tea, and then I went to sleep. Conrad announced the Stakeholders Summit 4 weeks later, a grand event. Global investors, press, board members, all gathered to celebrate what he was calling Whitmore & Kane's historic recovery. The recovery built on my stolen strategy. Sterling would present, Conrad would shine. They had given me, as a gesture of what I can only describe as magnificent irony, the job of coordinating logistics, the guest list, the seating chart, the audio-visual schedule, the room itself. I called Eleanor that same evening. She laughed, a real full laugh, and said, "Well, I suppose it's time." She still held 11% of the company's shares, and over the previous 8 months, she had been quietly, legally, gathering proxy votes from 3 other legacy shareholders who had grown tired and suspicious of Conrad's leadership. She had a quorum. She had been waiting for the right moment to use it. I had just handed her the room, the date, and the audience. The night before the summit, I sat alone in my apartment, and I let myself feel all of it. The fear, the weight of it, the strange grief of knowing that the next day everything would change and nothing would ever go back to what it was. I called my mother. She asked me in the way that mothers ask things when they already know the answer but need to hear your voice say it. "Baby, are you sure?" And I told her, "Mama, I've been sure since the day he asked me for coffee." The summit was everything Conrad had designed it to be. Beautiful, expensive, self-congratulatory. I moved through the room quietly, adjusting things, checking things, invisible as always. Conrad was at his most charming. Sterling was rehearsed and gleaming. The investors were impressed. The press was eating it up. Conrad took the stage to applause and began speaking about visionary leadership and the future of the brand with the total confidence of a man who has never once been held accountable for anything. When he called Sterling to the stage to present the recovery strategy, the presentation loaded on the main screen, and it was not Sterling's version. It was mine. My original files, my timestamps, a side-by-side comparison of his plagiarized version and my source documents, assembled and queued by the independent legal advisors team who had been given access to the AV system that morning by me. A murmur moved through the room like a current. Conrad's smile held for 3 full seconds before it broke. Sterling stood at the podium and said nothing. There was nothing to say. Then the second screen activated. The forensic financial report, the shell company documentation, the Milan partners' formal deposition confirming that Sterling had personally requested falsified delivery records to mask the company's losses. The independent legal advisor stood up from the third row and addressed the board directly. And then, from the front row, Eleanor Bassett stood up. Half the room didn't know who she was. The other half went absolutely still. She introduced herself. Co-founder, original shareholder, and as of that morning, the representative of a combined 31% shareholder block. She called for an emergency vote. She had the proxies, she had the quorum, she had everything she needed. In front of the press, the investors, and the full board, Conrad Whitmore III was removed as CEO effective immediately, pending a full financial and governance investigation. Sterling was escorted from the room by the company's legal team before the vote was even finished being recorded. In the chaos that followed, Conrad found me near the exit. He looked like a man who had just watched the floor dissolve under his feet. His voice was low. His hands were shaking slightly. He looked at me and asked, "Was this you? All of this?" And I looked back at him calmly, completely calmly, and I said, "You asked me to get coffee. I got you something much stronger." He had nothing left to say. Security walked him out of the building his grandfather had built, past the oil paintings in the lobby, past the staff who watched in silence, past the cameras that were already rolling. In the weeks that followed, the investigation moved quickly. Conrad and Sterling both faced formal legal proceedings. The Milan partners' deposition became part of a broader regulatory filing. And what came out publicly, what the press could not stop writing about, was that the so-called historic recovery Conrad had planned to celebrate that day was 94% derived from the framework of a senior analyst they had never invited to a single closed executive session. My name, the name they couldn't be bothered to learn, ran in every major fashion and business publication for 2 straight weeks. 3 women came to my office separately in the days after the summit. Each of them had their own version of the same story. Stolen work, erased credit, quiet accumulated indignity. I helped them document. I advocated for a formal equity and compensation review. Because I need you to understand something. I did not do any of this to win alone. Winning alone in a broken system just means you survived it. The point was to open the door and then hold it open. I went to visit Eleanor a month after everything settled. She poured tea, she smiled at me with those sharp, warm eyes and said, "I waited 20 years for someone to do what you did in 3. I asked her why she hadn't done it herself earlier, when she still had more power. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "Because it wasn't my time, it was yours." 1 year later, I sit at the head of that same boardroom table where a man once asked me to get more coffee. My title is Chief Strategy Officer. The company is rebuilding, genuinely this time, with real numbers and honest partnerships. We're expanding into 3 new markets. The fresh flowers still come every Monday morning. I still think they cost too much. But now, when I walk through those glass doors, the portraits of the people who built something real look back at me differently. Or maybe I just look back at them differently. Maybe that's the only thing that ever needed to change. I used to wonder sometimes if I should have spoken up sooner, if I wasted years being quiet when I should have been loud. But then I remember, every single move had to happen in exactly that order. The silence, the patience, the documentation. Eleanor, the room they handed me and the guest list they let me build. And then, at exactly the right moment, the truth. All of it, in that exact sequence. Take one piece away, and the whole thing falls apart. So no, I don't regret a single quiet morning. They never saw her coming, not because she was hiding, but because they had decided, without evidence and without thought, that she was not worth watching. She didn't fight fire with fire. She fought it with time-stamped files, chamomile tea, and a 71-year-old woman who still owned 11% of the shares. Never underestimate the quiet ones. They are usually the ones running the whole board. If this story moved you even a little, hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second and it helps more people find stories like this one. Subscribe so you never miss a new drop, and share this with someone in your life who needs to hear it today. Someone who is being overlooked. Someone who is being quiet and dangerous and building something nobody can see yet. Tell them their moment is coming. We'll see you in the next story. And trust me, that one is even wilder.